Our speaker is Jeff Hearn, a graduate of 3 UK universities, Oxford Brookes, Leeds and Bradford University. He's now attached to 3 institutions. I don't know where you find the time to do this, Jeff.
Very small amounts.
Örebro University in Sweden. In Finland, the Hanken School of Economics in Finland, and also University of Huddersfield. His research focuses on gender, sexuality, violence, age, work, organizations, management, policy, etc. But I know Jeff most in terms of his work on men and masculinities, and that is going to be the theme of today's talk. So I'll hand straight over, and thank you very much, Jeff, for being here.
Thank you, Eileen, and hello, everybody. I've seen many of you, and I've had some really good chats, actually, this conference, and those I haven't spoken to, I apologise, but maybe over lunch. Anyway, I'm going to talk about this topic. Yeah, it's there now. Good. And I mean, this conference has been wonderful. I mean, honestly, I think it's been amazing. And there's so many different things one could sort of reflect upon. But I'm just going to mention one very quick thing. It's about autoethnography, actually, because you raised that, and I'm really interested in that area, and I've done quite a lot in it. And I'll just mention one book that came out maybe last year, which is called the Handbook of Organizational Autoethnography. So within autoethnography, there's also subfields, including, I say, organizational autoethnography, and there are other subfields. And that's edited by Andrew Hearn, interesting name, who's in the US, and it got several prizes, actually, the whole book. Anyway, if you want to talk about that or anybody else, I'll be happy to talk about it. I think it's a very interesting, important issue. It's not about studying yourself. I think, as Helen said, it's about looking at positionality and how where you are affects what goes on. Okay, but now I'm going to talk through, or try and talk through some of these PowerPoints. I always make the mistake of preparing too much. I'm afraid that's my mistake. But I'm going to talk through some of these things. And that's what I'm going to begin with. So what is in the room? I guess you know what is in the room, right? When one talks about gender equality, this is the sort of sometimes unspoken thing, yes, masculinities, right. So that's what I'm going to try and focus on for the next, 35, 40 minutes. And I might skip over some of the things, because preparing has been quite difficult, partly because I'm not a physicist, I've never studied physics, never researched physics. I've researched on technology, but not physics. And so I feel a bit sort of out of some of these discussions. But anyway, here goes. So men and masculinities, right? There's been repeated, obviously, demonstrations about the persistence of inequalities, gender, intersectional inequalities. We all know that. That's why we're here. And these obviously concern women and girls, absolutely centrally. But they also involve everybody, in my view, in various ways. This has been talked about in the last 2 sessions and also yesterday. Men, boys, LGBTIQA+, and of course people who are GBTIQA+, may also be men and boys. So I'm interested in what I would call naming the privilege, or naming the unmarked. So what I'm saying, I think, is also hopefully of some relevance to other issues like, studying disability through also looking able-bodied. I'm also really interested in age, and I'm really a bit obsessed with talking about age. Always then directs you to the young people and the older people, but actually it's the middle unmarked adults who are the interesting ones, the normals, right? Anyway. I like the term absent presence, and so you might actually imagine that it will be quite difficult to avoid talking about men and masculinities if you're interested in gender equality. But actually, there are lots of really, really good, excellent policy and practice reports, including from the EU, which go through all the things that we know about, have been discussed the last 2 days, but actually they hardly mention men and masculinities. It's like... It's bizarre in some ways. And my strong position, both politically and academically, is that changing men and masculinities is part of the picture. it's not the only thing going on, but without that, it's a bit hard to imagine how you might reduce gender and other intersectional inequalities. And I mean, just to make the point, yeah, it's all there, good. This idea that institutions, universities, and research or science is somehow this gender-neutral thing, then add women. I mean, that's just nonsense, really, in my view. So, and it contrasts with the so-called failing boys discussion, or the boys failing discussion, which is very explicitly gendered, although it's not all boys, as we know, it's boys often vis-a-vis class, sometimes migration status, sometimes racialization. I use the word racialization, not race, by the way, actually. I think racialization is a much better word in English. So, I mean, these institutions are not gender neutral. We all know that, but somehow that is avoided. Just being a little bit sort of personal, I mean, I first got involved in this area in 1978. It's a long story, but I keep it short. We actually started, I worked in a, I would say, a broadly feminist department in the UK, and some of the men there, we formed a CR, consciousness raising group, and we met a couple of times in the department, and then realized a couple of the men were coming along for other reasons, like sort of ambiguous anti-feminist reasons. Then we moved the group out of the department and into the city, and then carried on for another 8 or 9 years. But that, and since, meanwhile, I was also researching on women and management, actually, and also on patriarchy. And those things since came together, and then started teaching courses on men and masculinities in 1984, I think, master's courses, initially with social work and community work students, and then in being asked in women's studies courses, which was a very interesting thing to do at that time. And then 1988, this is just like a reminder for me, there was, I think, one of the first international conferences on men and masculinities. So this is a little bit of history, basically, which was in Bradford, organised by David Morgan, who died sadly last year, I think, and myself. And that was a kind of important conference, if those are interested in the sort of mini history of these things. And the keynote speaker of that conference, and this is very important, I think, was Jana Hanma, an important feminist. So in a sense, from that feminist, I'm not say feminist women scholars were actually heavily involved in this critical work of men and masculinities. This is not like a men's area, do you understand? This is an important thing to say. And she coined the term naming men as men. And again, you can say naming white people as white people, do you understand? Or whatever. And I mean, one can read that terminology a number of ways, actually, but I think, you know, she's saying, well, if the top of the university is men, let's say that. If the trade union is men, let's name that. It's not saying perhaps something that is more than that. But I mean, to discuss this, to have this as the focus, in a sense, it, as I say, might be odd. It might be somehow uncomfortable. Not necessarily in this situation, but in some situations, to actually have a discussion where this is the focus is a bit weird, right? You understand? Yeah, okay. This is something one can do. When I was teaching those courses, I often began by asking the question, what is a man? It's a very difficult question to answer, actually. Or what is a real man, or what are masculinities? I mean, one can reflect on this oneself, or one can ask students this. One can spend 5 minutes or 5 hours on this. This is my attempt to summarize some of the discussions, debates that have been going on in the last 40 years. It's a long story, and the term that I prefer is, I never use the term men's studies. I hate the term men's studies. It's really, really bad. I prefer the term critical studies of men and masculinity, or CSMM for short. And these studies, of which now are very extensive, I mean, they begin partly from a critique of role theory, gender role theory, sex role theory, and then look at men and masculinities as the critical object, as being socially constructed over time, changing across history, culture, in societies, and biographically as well, which also links to the auto-ethnography question as well, I think, and differential relations to power, as have been discussed. I mean, Helen and many others have raised this. with these kinds of terminology, dominant, hegemonic, implicit, marginal, or marginalized, subordinated, which I'll come back to in a second. And I think one of the most important issues is to look at men and masculinities both materially, which includes the body, but also materially like labor, conditions of work, and so on, reproduction and production, and discursively. And the intersectionality issue is absolutely central as well. And again, I wouldn't see it as being so new, actually. But more recently now, there's been movements, much more importantly. I mean, the interesting work going on for me is not in global north, actually, at all. It's in the so-called global south. I work a lot with people in South Africa, and I think what's going on there is much more interesting than studying Finland or Sweden or UK. So the decolonial, post-colonial moment is really important here, as is the post-human and new materialist, as was discussed in relation to Karen Barad and others yesterday. I don't know if Alexandra is here. Yes, you are, yeah. So this is some of the things that are going on now, I would say, most importantly. This is one of the most cited quotations from Raewyn Connell, my friend in Australia. Hegemonic masculinity, it's a very well-used term. It's sometimes used, I think, in a very, not very helpful way, but this is the sort of one of the definitions, the configuration of gender practice. So it's about practice, about what men do, which embodies the currently accepted answer to the problem of legitimacy. It's about legitimacy. What is legitimate? What is okay? What is authorized? What is of patriarchy, which we could discuss a long time, which guarantees or attains guarantee the dominant position of men, subordination of women. Of course, one can go on and refine this in many ways. It's also worth mentioning, I don't know, Raewyn Connell's first use of hegemonic masculinity was actually about bodies, actually, in 1979. So the embodiment turn is not new either. This is part of my introduction, sort of, yeah. And then for me, these are some things that I think are very important just in terms of this. I call this a subfield of gender studies. It's not a field, it's a subfield of gender studies, okay, in my view. There's a lot of debate around the term masculinities, actually, which is a complication. I mean, I use it, I've used it in the title, I think. It's convenient, but it's still got, I would say, a kind of psychological baggage to it. No offense to Jon, but I think because the term masculinity in the singular comes largely from a psychological model, and even pluralizing to masculinities, it still carries the idea that, you know, that I have this masculinity somehow in my brain or in my body. And I think there are some problems with the term, but it's convenient. And different people use it in totally different ways, actually. And I think material discursive analysis is very, very central. I do a lot of work on violence. If you're interested in violence, violence is really material, but also it's very discursive, how violence is constructed and understood. Patriarchy, I still think, is a useful term. I mean, you can refine it in various ways. I like the idea, though, of thinking about patriarchy transnationally. There are transnational patriarchies, you could say. I mean, the internet is a kind of transnational patriarchy. I also like the idea of thinking about the abolition of men, not killing men, but as a social category of power, to think about that process. And then the person is political, an old phrase, is also work and theoretical. Okay, so that's my little introduction. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I'm trying to watch the time here. When you give this kind of talk, you're told in the guides, you're meant to tell people what's important to say. Well, there's two things I want to say that are important. One is to change men. That's what we've got to do, actually. Sorry, I should laugh. Changing men is one of the most important things to do. The other thing, which is a bit more complicated, has two parts. Men, I still think, is a persistent, really powerful, but not all powerful, taken for granted presence and social category pervading power relations in society, academia, and research. I mean, again, saying this in this company perhaps is not necessary, but I think the sort of pervasive and recouping of power, if you understand, how power then is recouped and grabbed back subtly, is really, really heavy. But at the same time, the category of men is incredibly diverse, from the most violent, most brutal formulations to the questioning of being men at all, or those who are struggling with being men. And I think the notion of disidentifying with men is also actually important, and not, as was discussed yesterday, I think, a couple of times, not this re-binarizing, is that a word? I'm not sure, or re-essentializing. That's a danger, I think, all the time, actually. Okay, so there's a kind of paradox. I mean, I'm told physicists are used to dealing with paradox, but there's a kind of paradox to be engaged with here. This sort of very heavy pervasiveness, power, and then this variation, diversity, including who is a man at all. So it's both this naming, to go back naming, but also deconstructing, to use the term, I think, did you use it? You used it, I think, yeah. Again, you can reflect, and this also was raised, I say, yesterday by, you can ask people, what has being a man or not being a man, how has that affected your career? As I think was it Lucy yesterday who raised this online? I think, I'm not sure. I think so. But you can also ask, how would your career have been different if you had not been a man, a woman, or further gender? I think it's important to say further, not other gender, by the way, as well. And you can do this with students, with colleagues, with yourself, if you want to. Okay. For most of the rest of the time, I'm going to talk about three so-called interconnects, or three things. And in a way, this mirrors what Londa was talking about on the first morning. Morning, yeah. It feels like a long time ago. So one issue, if one's interested in changing men masculinities, and I mean this both politically and practically and also academically, it's a question of how does that work in terms of, let's call it gender equal interactions. One can put gender equal intersectional interactions, if you like, but trying to keep this short. Right? So that's one level. Another level is how this works in relation to institutions, managing and controlling of resources. And then this third level is the question of content and knowledge and so on. Yeah. Could you pass, Thomas, around these things? Now, yeah. I decided to do a piece of paper. I mean, sometimes people like a piece of paper. It's like, it's just got some things on it which I'll flip through, but it's, yeah, you'll see what they are, just a few things. So I'm just going to talk quite a bit on the first level, and then a little bit briefly on the second and third, if that's okay. Because I do think, as well as this sort of huge structure of patriarchies in the plural, or transnational patriarchies, the everyday is extremely important, particularly in terms of the concerns of this conference, in the sense of, and this relates to your presentation as well, Joanna, yeah, in terms of what goes on actually in an everyday way and how to actually get some take on that. So I just want to think about men and masculinities in everyday interactions, in the doing of research, the doing of science, the doing of physics, the dynamics of research teams, projects, publishing, and the notion of, I mean, there's been several talks about cultures. I think also one's got to think about mini cultures, cultures even of, say, 6 colleagues. Examples might be the family sort of model, paternalist model with a sort of, a man leader, the gentleman's club. I mean, sport also, I don't know about your working places, sport figures very strongly in some university context. And the issue of homosociality, I think, is a very, very important issue to grasp, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And homosociality also links very much to issues of anti-racism and anti-ageism and gender and sexual identity. I think several or many of you know this citation from Cherry-Ann 2000 and colleagues, 2016, in Psychological Bulletin, I think. The reference is on the piece of paper, which was a sort of overview of gender disparity, so-called, looking at undergraduate level in the US. And again, what we now know, the sort of finding from that overview, that masculine cultures is one of the central issues. But masculine cultures can take many different forms, I think, as I just said. I mean, they can be very hierarchical, very apparently sort of democratic amongst men, I mean, and so on. And then the further point from the Cherian et al. Study about male-orientated stereotypes, negative stereotypes about women's abilities and role models, as again discussed yesterday. Okay, so then back what's in the room. Yes, this is our friend the elephant, right? I think this is also trying to perhaps get you to reflect on your own situations or the colleagues around you. You know, this refers to an article by Richard Collier, who's a professor of socio-legal studies in Newcastle University in the UK. And it's a way of thinking about, in academia and higher education, there are sort of ways of being both a good man, or being a man of a certain kind, and also being an academic, right? So he goes through some of these examples. The nutty professor, the administrator, the entrepreneur, an increasingly important category, I think, actually. The fundraiser, the sexual predator, the young man in a hurry, a very important category as well, actually. The infantilized intellectual who can't plug the computer in, and so on, even the academic couple, even the pro-feminist. And you can think about how this relates to your own situation, maybe add some more categories as well. I think in terms of equality, again, perhaps this is saying the obvious, but because one has, you know, some men who are active, there are a few here, I think, who are active supporters of equality, and then some who are totally, actively, some who are passive, and then some who are basically hypocritical. I mean, basically, let's be blunt here. There's other categories, I think, the heavy publisher and nothing else, the non-researching research gatekeeper, I think another important, I mean, we can go on. This obviously is very contingent to different situations. Homosociality, on the little piece of paper I passed around, there's some more notes on homosociality. I mean, Jean Lippmann-Blumen, I think, is credited often with the sort of developing this notion, 1976, I think. But it's still very powerful. And I mean, it's the irony, to be heterosexual, the way to do it is to spend time with men, basically. That's the sort of easy way of thinking about it, I think, which is a kind of interesting twist. And it's a way in which talking about how it can involve imitation, mimicry, adulation, emotional charge, maybe even erotic charge between men who are not necessarily gay at all, but actually are heterosexually defined, but actually get a lot of emotional sustenance from other men. There's different versions of homosociality. You probably know this all-male panels. I think you referred to it, I think, in passing, I think, developed by Sara Sama in Tampere in Finland, where I live. And if you haven't seen that, I guess most of you have seen it. Have you? Probably, yeah, okay. No? Oh, well, you must find it immediately. These are just a couple of examples. Momentum, this is a celebration of the year from Eindhoven, and someone's written no women on top of that, which was creative. Another one is, this is about, is the world ready for global justice? Well, probably not. So, and then this is, I wouldn't say my favorite, that's terrible to say, but this is the 25th World Congress on Controversies in Obstetrics. Well, yeah, clearly there are. So, but I mean, that site is a source of serious fun, or if you understand, I mean, really, and it can be used in teaching or shown to colleagues, or you can even post things there, and so on and so forth. Right, rushing on. One of the things I passed around was this sort of list of, I think, yeah, the piece of paper, it has some sort of little tips which can be useful, again, with colleagues, things to be avoided, you know, hogging the show, as I'm doing now for the next few minutes, speaking in capital letters, you know, being defensive, like, oh, don't threaten me, you know, always being negative, you know. I mean, I think there's Raymond Williams, the cultural theorist or whatever, said something like, I have to get this right, you know, to be a true radical, you've got to be optimistic and hopeful, actually. It's all very well being negative and critical, which I tend to be quite a lot, but negativism has its own enemy, is that right? How much? Intransigence, yeah. Tips on the piece of paper, there's other tips about things to do, like relaxing, which I'm trying to do now. Not speaking on every topic in seminars. Interrupting others' oppressive behavior. I mean, that sounds very easy, but it's not easy at all. I mean, particularly, I think, around, yeah, I'll say this, I think it's particularly difficult actually around racism, actually, but it applies to all the isms, I think. But that's something in itself which needs attention. Okay, and so these things are in more longer lists on the piece of paper, as I said. Very briefly, there was a lot of talk yesterday, I mean, from Anne Papin and others about the institutions and about resources, and clearly the EU is very, very concerned about the gender equality, intersectional equality issues vis-à-vis the management and resource distribution, and that's on their agenda, I know, and there are projects going on now. So this issue of who are the leaders, who are the project leaders, how does that work in your own locality? Ulf Sandström, some of you may know, a Swedish researcher, has done this work critiquing, as I understand it, the allocation of some very large lumps of krona to men-led centres of excellence, which under that actually are others who are not so productive. So even in sort of conventional terms, he's done an evaluation of that, if that's of interest to you. And then there are all sorts of ways of managing and so on. I mean, I think that there is quite a lot of research now which does contrast, I mean, in a sort of binary way, women as managers and men as managers, and some of that does tend to find that, you know, women managers may tend to be more transformative and men more transactional, if you understand. But on the other hand, there's other research that finds no difference. And then there's other research which actually finds that women, particularly in the corporate world, women who become corporate leaders actually have to be more achievement-orientated and more focused in that way, because it's harder to get there, putting it bluntly. So the situation is a bit more complicated than just talking about the two groups. I'm going to mention one piece of research which actually has been done by the first person I supervised as a PhD in Finland, called Denise Salin, with some colleagues. And it's looking at, well, laissez-faire management and authoritarian management are both bad news, basically, putting it very simply, particularly around like workplace bullying. It's like a U-curve, okay? But this has just been published, and the reference is on the piece of paper, which is that what is particularly interesting is when you look at so-called high-performance work practices, HPWPs, which is relevant, I think, to discussions in physics. We've been talking about an excellence and so on. The study wasn't done on physics, but it's about how that kind of work context, high-performance context, may lead to more competition, more incivility, particularly when it's coupled, the worst combination is with laissez-faire management. So if you have this high-performance culture going on, you actually need so-called active management to deal with what happens in terms of competition, both externally and internally. So that's an article that's just been published literally this year. And then the men masculine, I like these pictures, I found these. Anyway, gender equal knowledge, perhaps a very common phrase. And again, this has come up many times in different ways, and well, including in Helen's last session, very much, I think, different ways of approaching this. And we have several historians here, and I do think looking at the history of disciplines is a kind of like an easy way. Sorry, I don't mean it's a clearer way to see these dominations, looking at the 18th century, 19th century, etc., than it is to see this now in the present, you know, to actually see what was going on. And that, I think, should be part of the education in these disciplines, to actually just know it, and then to actually link that to gender, obviously. The question of theories, approaches, which are promoted and which are ignored, and by whom, naming men and masculinities in research and teaching content, the kind of cases that are used. Cases are really popular in business schools. I work in a business school in Finland, because that's where they would have me when I immigrated to Finland. Power and hierarchy in knowledge making, support and respect for feminism and gender studies, and this relates to the last presentation, or the lack of respect, clearly. I think this is absolutely fundamental. Gendering the ungendered, what appears to be ungendered. In Sweden, there's this famous video on snow clearing. If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing, how snow clearing is a gender issue. And it's just a good example of something that at first sight, snow clearing. Snow clearing is neutral, but it's not, of course. And deconstructing men and masculinities, right. And these three areas, these everyday issues, the institutional issues, and the knowledge issues, all interconnect. I mean, that would be another discussion. I actually think this fairly recent paper by Begany et al. In Science and Advances, which isn't particularly about gender, actually, but it is pointing out those who think bias is not happening tend to be the key drivers of bias as a kind of so-called high-risk group. I think that's an interesting paper, although I say it's not particularly about gender. Right. Getting to the last bit. What is to be done? Well, I mean, I just think all these, I don't think there's no simple solution, obviously. I mean, it's obvious. I think all these issues are totally relevant, and all the issues discussed the last 2 days are totally relevant at all the different, it's not a good word, levels, but you know what I mean, the different context, whether it's individual practice, whether it's the team or the research group, whether it's the institution, the unit, the whole university, the national. But I do think increasingly there is a greater need, and it was mentioned, I think, by Anne Pepin, I think, there's a greater need for looking at how these kind of things work transnationally. I mean, obviously the EU is an obvious example here, but also the whole question of university partnerships and cross-national collaborations. There was this famous example in Finland where maybe 15 years ago, they created these special high-profile, high-prestige professorships for visiting professors. And all the universities were asked in Finland to submit their nomination. And in the first year, they all submitted men. Yeah, basically. Because they all put their sort of top of the list, you understand? So this kind of transnational way of thinking about these things, I think, and deconstructing it, I think is really, really central. What encourages some men to get more involved in promoting? Well, this again is a bit of a sort of random listery. The question of allyship, which again was mentioned by, I can't remember who, maybe yesterday. Yeah, promoting allyship in many different ways, and also promoting, which is difficult perhaps to sum up, a sense of vulnerability. Like men don't need to know everything and saying you don't know, or not getting it right. Linking it to the job as was he deputy rector? Yeah, here. Made very clear. I think he said that as part of his job. He's got to do this, basically, and positively. The home and work issue has been mentioned. There's quite a debate going on around caring masculinities as a kind of motif for thinking about these issues, different kinds of caring masculinities. The benefits of gender equality for men, which I'll come back to in a second. If you look at this on a global scale, societal scale, then there are definitely benefits, actually, to men for being in a more gender equal society. Like health benefits, and there's less violence from other men, putting it very simply, and that's been studied quite a bit. Of course, when you get down to the more local level, as you discussed, it's a bit more complicated. And I think it's important not to talk about everything being a win-win. It's not. And not, on the other hand, to talk about everything being a zero-sum game, because it's not either. So those two metaphors are both wrong. But the benefit issue, I think, is still there. I mean, there is also this research, particularly in the US, about how, men who are more gender equal have better relationships and, happier and all those kinds of things, which, is nice and okay. But that may not be the highest priority to think about. You can ask men also, where do you stand, if you like, as well. But the last thing I want to just go on to, my last minute or so, I mean, this is a triangle, which you've probably seen before, some of you, but I find it really, personally, quite useful. It was developed in the mid-90s by Mike Mesner in California, I think, where he talked about why do men get interested in gender, feminism, gender equality, and sketched out sort of 3 motivations, if you like. So one is the top of the thing is the sort of justice or the stopping privileges motivation. And that also has got implications for producing more just and better research, as discussed by several people. Then there's the motivation of highlighting difference or differences. So the argument that there are different groups of men. There are gay men, bisexual men, there are black men, and so on. And there's an interest there for getting involved. And then the third one is this prioritizing costs of masculinity, like health costs and so on. And the problem with the third one, the bottom left-hand corner, is that that's the only agenda and nothing else that actually can be counterproductive vis-a-vis gender equality and feminism and so on. But it's a useful framework, I think, to think about. But if you take the top of the apex, the top of the triangle, and then look at it a bit more closely, and this is drawing on Judith Lorber's work, again in the US, you can find 3 different, or at least 3 different ways of thinking about the top of the triangle. One is a kind of reformist agenda, which is basically abolishing gender imbalance, right? Equal numbers and equal fair shares. The second one is this resistance model, which is abolishing patriarchy or changing society. And the third one is the rebellious, which is abolishing or changing gender categories, and therefore you can have big disagreements, actually, in terms of the top of the triangle, what is being aimed at, even though you might all agree, whether it's men or others. Okay, the last thing I'm going to say is, these are just 2 quotes that I really like. But I was talking to Mary Lou last night in the dinner, and one of the things we talked about was about the importance of sustaining commitment, actually. I mean, and this, I guess, is something which is talked about in the network, in general network, I guess, how to sustain commitment, not just for 6 months or 6 years, but for 60 years. I think this is a really very central issue, which has to be perhaps put more centrally into the discussion. And it's not easy, and it involves all sorts of mutual support and mutual care and respect and so on and so forth. And finally, thanks for listening. I'm going to mention the UNICEF project. Some of you know I'm involved in a small way. It's on gender-based violence, including sexual harassment in universities and research performing organizations, which is ongoing. If anyone's interested in that, just have a word. I recommend strongly Eileen's free book, Eileen and Siobhan Canavan's. If you haven't seen it, it's free online. Download it. There's, if you haven't seen it, just go and get it. And there's been discussion about intersectionality, and I don't know how to put this. I'm involved in co-managing editor with Nina Luque, who some of you know, a book series which is called Routledge Advances in Feminist Studies and Intersectionality. And we have about 40 books or more in that book series. And the point about saying this is that there are many different ways of looking at intersectionality. And some of them are very categorical, and some are very anti-categorical in terms of, and I think it's important to be very open-minded about what that means. And then finally, if you don't know about it, I really recommend checking out Men Engage Alliance, which is a global organization of women, men, non-binary people, focusing on changing men and boys. And they had what's called the Ubuntu Declaration fairly recently. During COVID, they had 7 months of online events, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 a week, and really, really about everything in the world. It's an activist come project, social change or movement organization, but a lot of it is also academically informed and highly relevant to know about, at least. I recommend it very strongly. And my time is up, or a little bit over. Yeah, okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.